Well, good day. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak to you. I appreciate you tuning in, and I will talk to you a bit about the situation in Louisiana and increasing influences of the ocean in the Louisiana coastal zone. Climate change is threatening cities and coastal populations across the globe, as I'm sure you've heard throughout the run of this conference, and that raises grave risks to flooding. And what is sometimes underappreciated is that flood risk will also creep up rivers that empty into coastal areas after they cross low-lying coastal plains, and they will add to environmental justice tensions that are already in place, where flood management remains fixated on riparian risk and has not turned its attention to the inland advance of coastal influences. This paper considers topographic justice in the Amite River Basin in southeast Louisiana. In terms of topography, the Amite rises in southern Mississippi and drains a portion of 3 Louisiana parishes, or what you might know them as counties. The uppermost basin is largely rural, with forest and livestock grazing as the dominant land uses. East Baton Rouge Parish, home to the state capital, is highly urbanized, while its eastern neighbor, Livingston, has become a booming bedroom community for the larger city. They lie astride the Amite's middle course, where there is adequate gradient to allow reasonable drainage, and where the river and its main tributary, the Comite, have built a floodplain that is subject to inundation during high river stages. Ascension Parish, which, like Livingston, has been experiencing suburbanization at a rapid pace since the 1970s, straddles the lower course of the river, where there is very little gradient, and much of the parish has long been susceptible to flooding. After flowing across the low-lying coastal plain, the river empties into the near sea level Lake Maurepas, which is susceptible to considerable influences from surge-driven tropical cyclones that can generate dangerous conditions when there is a combination of heavy rainfall, runoff, and lake level rise. Suburbanization has greatly increased the population, land cover, property at risk, and runoff from the 3 parishes. In the lower reaches, the combination of recent development and coastal risk are most evident. Thomas Thaler and his associates asked the question, does flood risk management privilege upstream people and properties over downstream territories? This question poses both procedural and distributional social justice issues that are bound up in this relationship between people and place, shaped by topography and hazards. In cities in the U.S. South, wealth and whiteness have often been associated with topographic privilege. Ullin and Wharf considered altitudinal zonation as one process contributing to environmental risk for disenfranchised African Americans across the region. In terms of distribution, their generalization is somewhat at odds with the conditions in the Amite River Basin. While many Black neighborhoods are subject to topographic injustice in the Baton Rouge region, the most extreme and geographically extensive risks are posed to post-1970 middle-class suburbs in the lower basin. And the African American neighborhoods, the distressed areas, are shown in the dark color here. Procedurally, flood management is fragmented among 3 parishes and has been oriented exclusively to riparian risk reduction strategies, largely relying on facilitating drainage, which diverts excess flow to the lower river basin. With global warming and sea level rise, a new category of risk from the coast is pushing upstream and has prompted consideration of climate change adaptation in a program run by the state's Coastal Management Authority. Upstream officials have yet to factor this emerging risk into flood mitigation planning, and drainage acceleration remains the principal strategy for managing excess water. A major flood in 2016 renewed public interest in flood control and has reactivated upstream-downstream conflicts over mitigation policies and programs. Environmental justice, an emerging concern after the 2016 flood, has gained traction at the neighborhood and parish scale, but not yet for the entire basin. The inability of governing bodies to fully address flood mitigation at the basin scale is perpetuating injustices tied to riparian risk and fails to address the emerging climate-driven risk, which are expanding flood zones up the stream as coastal residents at the same time migrate into these very same areas. As part of a larger project known as Inland from the Coast, which has examined changing flood risk in the Amite River Basin, community well-being, and best practices for flood mitigation, this research is built on mixed methods. It relied on a review of historical accounts of floods, flood and hazard mitigation policy, public comments on drafts for flood control projects, and public policy changes dealing with flood risk. A second component of the research tapped local expertise through a series of focus groups and a pair of scenario building workshops. After the two most recent floods in this basin in 1983 and 2016, internal basin conflicts have arisen over the environmental justice of flood mitigation efforts, centered on the displacement of flood risk by accelerated drainage from upstream communities to the downstream territory. The environmental justice debate does not pit the socially marginalized against an entrenched and privileged bureaucracy. Most of the downstream development has been by middle-class whites seeking a suburban setting with schools that have high percentages of white students. The upstream proponents of drainage are both rural, non-farm residents who fear loss of their land if there's a storage reservoir built, or residents of the slightly higher urban neighborhoods who are largely responsible for contributing to larger volumes of runoff. There is a sizable African-American population in Baton Rouge proper who live in many of the more distressed neighborhoods that suffered severe flooding in 2016. They have a more prominent say in local politics and are not entirely disenfranchised. And also the city has had a black mayor for more than 12 years. So there is some attention paid to African-American concerns. Nonetheless, maintenance of city services, particularly drainage canals, were a main factor in neighborhood flooding in 2016 in both black and white neighborhoods. Upstream residents of all backgrounds clamor for better drainage, while suburban middle-class whites in the lower basin have expressed their objection to drainage as a primary solution for the basin. The imbalance in upstream and downstream is accentuated by the presence of the largest urban population in the middle basin, seen here. Through sheer volume and legislative representation, they have a more powerful political voice and also displace the most runoff. This creates the potential for an imbalance at forums that allow public input into flood management plans and in legislative decisions. Rural residents see no reason that they should sacrifice land to protect downstream dwellers and have been vocal in their positions. So there is effectively a three-way conflict: upstream rural, middle stream urban, and lower basin suburban. Decades of policy that promoted urban development in Baton Rouge and the rapid removal of water from expanding suburbs allowed suburban sprawl to spread into Livingston and Ascension parishes. Thus, on the eve of the 2016 flood, these two parishes, along with eastern Baton Rouge, had far more houses and residents at risk than when the 1983 flood occurred. A surprisingly frank post-flood report notes that after the 1983 flood, pointed out the tendency in Baton Rouge to blame rural upstream neighbors for flood-inducing runoff, when actually the conversion of agricultural land to forest in the preceding decades had reduced runoff, thus questioning the equity of imposing a reservoir on upstream landowners. It also reports that only Ascension Parish had undertaken any sort of significant land damage reduction program by building a series of canals and levees. The author of this report asserts that the reluctance of midstream communities to pay for flood control projects that would benefit their downstream neighbors, which exemplified the absence of basin-wide solutions, and even points out the benefit-cost method of the Corps of Engineers in evaluating flood control projects does not consider the equity effect on future development. The author goes on to state that downstream dwellers feel it is unfair to exclude the benefit of future development in planning flood control measures and to place the interests of a minority ahead of the majority downstream. Yet, in the Amite Basin, the majority resided in Baton Rouge, which favored imposing costs on upstream landowners in the form of a reservoir and also on downstream residents in the form of additional discharges from the city. In the late 1980s, both Ascension and Livingston faced economic challenges and decreased funding for the internal flood mitigation. Voters repeatedly rejected local taxes for improved risk reduction even with the 1983 flood in their rearview mirror. Outside experts promoted basin-wide solutions through a newly formed River Basin Commission, which encompassed the entire Louisiana portion of the river basin. But the commission had no authority, and with land use jurisdiction embedded in parish politics and finances, the upper lower river basin interests prevailed and continued to compound existing conflict. Public response to proposed flood mitigation projects continued to reflect the upstream-downstream tensions. Proposed mitigation projects met opposition. A proposal to dredge the lower Comeet met resistance from middle and upstream residents who argued it would destroy sport fishing. Consideration of an upstream flood storage reservoir ran into harsh criticism from upstream residents, in contrast to the hearty support from lower floodplain populations. A public forum on flood solutions in 1990 included officials from the 3 river basin parishes who argued for a regional approach, but local interest eclipsed basin-wide solutions. An East Baton Rouge official sought the reservoir in the upper basin, but upstream landowners asked why they would have to pay and sacrifice land to protect downstream residents. In Ascension Parish, officials argued that downstream problems were not solely the result of development there. He observed that upstream development was causing flooding in Ascension, where there had never been flooding before. 7 years following the 1983 flood, the first substantive environmental impact statement for a major flood mitigation plan appeared. The option under consideration was the Amite River Diversion Canal, with benefits principally to the upper and lower basin, and virtually no cost in terms of land submerged beneath the reservoir in the upper basin. The diversion canal was the most equitable basin-wide option and met with hearty support and approval. Only modest local tributary projects reached completion in the interval between the 1983 flood and the next calamitous flood in August 2016. There were several notable floods in that interim in 1990, 93, 2001, plus a spring flood the same year in 2016. Flood mitigation improvements, which featured drainage in the middle basin and a combination of levee and drainage works in the lower basin, along with some minor adjustments in building codes and land use practices, did not prepare the basin for a flood that exceeded the 1983 crest by over 5 feet and caused far more damage than the previous record-setting event. The Comeet River Diversion Canal, while supported by local taxpayers throughout the basin and approved by Congress, had largely stalled since its authorization in 1992. The Amite River Basin Authority remained advisory, with no regulatory authority in terms of basin-wide land use, regulation, zoning, or building codes. The uneven risks pointed out repeatedly in flood mitigation reports after 1983 persisted when the rains began to fall in August 2016. Political fragmentation of the flood-prone Amite River Basin has created an ideal situation for topographic injustices. The upper basin contains forest and pasture land with sufficient topography to enable efficient drainage downstream away from dispersed houses atop uplands. The middle basin has less topographic relief and has experienced considerable middle-class sprawl across the floodplains of the main river and its numerous tributaries. Developments shed more runoff while developers have installed minimal drainage systems, far inadequate to accommodate the discharge from their developments. Parish officials have eagerly permitted the proliferation of subdivisions with little regard for their collective impact. Despite frequent floods, there has been little effort toward flood coordination among parishes or with the state's coastal protection planning effort. The exceptional precipitation in 2016 exposed the cumulative results of both floodplain encroachment by development and inadequate mitigation. For over a century, authorities have claimed basin-scale drainage and flood management is tantamount to reducing flood risk in the basin. But in the absence of a basin-wide strategy, flood risk has grown at the lower edges of the many new subdivisions or has been diverted to the lower basin. While many in at-risk suburban neighborhoods are middle class, they and the entrepreneurs who develop the subdivisions argue that architectural floodproofing would simply make these properties too expensive and stymie development. Local authorities who desire the added tax revenue from new developments are adverse to requiring floodproof construction. These procedural steps impose risk on individual homeowners. The absence of both a basin-wide approach and effective restrictions on floodplain development perpetuate the topographic injustices in the Amite River Basin. A recently formed state watershed initiative seeks wider collaboration, and the State Coastal Authority could step in and offer, provide guidance as well on looking at coastal climate change issues. Local authorities could also provide guidance as it deals with rising sea levels, but it has not turned its attention inland yet. Yet a topographically unjust and unsafe approach fails to incorporate the emerging coastal risk and exemplifies challenges faced by other inland areas near the shore around the world. Thank you.